My name is Mike Crowley. I teach in the English department here at Denison, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Welcome Beck Thursdays event. The Beck series is one of Denison's great traditions and the lasting gift of alumna Harriet Ewins Beck, who, like our host tonight, Torie Clarke, was a native of Pittsburgh. The Beck series has brought to campus some of the most important names in American literature of the last 50 plus years, including the most recent Nobel laureate, named today, Louise Glick, as well, who was last here in 2005. And though we are virtual this year, our list of readers and class visitors this fall has been no less impressive due to the circumstances of COVID. We encourage you to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and to seek out future events at denison.edu/Beck. In 2 weeks, our own Peter Grambois and Jack Schuler will be reading from their new books and will be in conversation with each other. But tonight, we're delighted, and I truly mean that, to have with us Connie Schultz and Torie Clarke. This is a different format for us in that once I get out of the way, Torie will take over the hosting duties and have a conversation with Connie about her fantastic new novel, The Daughters of Erietown. I will assume if you've jumped on this call tonight, you have come here in part because you know the ties both of these women have and have had to the politics that guide our nation. And because this is a reading crowd, a literary crowd, I will make a further assumption that many of you have looked at the events of our politics the last 4 years with, shall we say, a degree of consternation. And while I hope Connie and Torie will touch upon what they have witnessed and what they foresee for us in that realm, I brought them together because I know they love to read. The act of reading literature, as many of us know, as those of us that make our living in the world teaching about its joys and wonders, can in its best moments render us equals, travelers on the same road, on the same planet, in search often of the same things: the emotional nourishment of acceptance, the grace of human touch, the feeling that no one has ever longed or yearned for anything quite like you until you find that stranger in a book going about her life in a way that is nearly identical to yours, despite the differences in eras, in country, ethnicity, or gender. The ability for books to both sate and amaze us is nearly infinite. Take, for instance, The Daughters of Erietown, a novel about a working class family set in Northeast Ohio. It contains all the pain and triumph of Greek tragedy. There are thwarted dreams, desires indulged, and a family trying, sometimes desperately, to find the narrow strips of light in a life that seems to take and rarely gives. Connie's novel is a master class in empathy, an unflinching look at the ways in which parents throw the entirety of their lives, from their physical bodies to the relinquishing of their own dreams, to ensure that children don't have to. Faulkner said the writer's aim is to write about the heart in conflict with itself. And every character of this beautiful debut novel is fighting an existential battle, constantly afraid that they will not only lose that battle, but take down the people they love with them. It is an achievement. I'm excited for what we will learn tonight from Connie and Torie. Connie Schultz won the Pulitzer Prize in 2005 for commentary, for columns that judges praise for providing a voice for the underdog and the underprivileged. She is a nationally syndicated columnist for Creators Syndicate and professional in residence at Kent State University School of Journalism, her alma mater. She is the author of 2 previous books, Life Happens and Other Unavoidable Truths, a collection of essays, and His Lovely Wife, a memoir about her husband Sherrod Brown's successful 2006 race for the U.S. Senate. The Daughters of Erietown was released in June and is a New York Times bestseller. James Carville once said, if she were a bumper sticker, Torie Clarke would read, "Been there, fix that." In over 30 years, Torie Clarke has engineered countless examples of strategies employed successfully in corporate boardrooms in the highest policy arenas. From Berlin to Brooklyn, she helps policymakers, executives, and companies pursue opportunities, diffuse crises, and beat the competition in the incredibly turbulent information age of the 21st century. Torie's public sector career includes serving in 3 administrations, most recently at the Department of Defense and for Senator John McCain. In the private sector, she worked for Comcast, the National Cable Television Association, WPP, and many of the nation's leading executives. In addition to appearances on every major news outlet, Clarke is host of Chatter on Books, her entertaining and intellectual look at books that is dispossessed of snobbery, and a regular contributor to the Tony Kornheiser Show, as well as the author of Lipstick on a Pig, Winning in the No-Spin Era by Someone Who Knows the Game, and A Survivor's Guide to Washington, How to Succeed Without Losing Your Soul. Thank you both for being here. Torie, I cede the Zoom to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Connie, I don't know about you. I feel like we should just stop now. That's as good as it's going to get.
I know. Wow. Thank you, Mike.
Mike, that
what
was
a good
lovely.
Man.
Really
what a good
lovely.
man and a talented man.
A good man. Let's start with this, Connie. Where did you first meet Mike?
With this Midwestern journalists group that they were hosting at Denison. That's where I first met him, because they cared about the stories being told about the heartland, mostly because the stories were not being particularly accurate.
Yeah.
But then I got to know him so much better as a writer himself. I've read a lot of his work. And he just got a new anthology out that I wrote a foreword to. And
Midland.
I've never known anyone more supportive of other writers as Mike. I have just never seen anybody. There's just no envy there, which is the best way to do it. It's always the best way to do it.
For those of you who were listening to our 15 minutes of blather before we came on, which is mostly about our dogs, I met Mike through Tony Kornheiser. And our show, Chatter on Books, is a spin-off of Tony Kornheiser Show. And Tony's son, Michael, said, I think you ought to read this guy, Mike Crowley. It's kind of interesting. Any Other Place, it's a collection of essays. And it's wonderful. And I kept saying, when I read it, and then I got to meet Mike, who's just delightful, I said, this is what Hillbilly Elegy wanted to be. This is what Hillbilly Elegy wanted to be, what's really going on there. So Mike, thank you so much for bringing us together. It is an honor and privilege to be with everybody tonight. And Connie, I'm a huge fan. I know you hear this all the time, but it is a real privilege. I think what we'd like to do is a little bit about your backstory. A zillion people know you, but there are half a zillion listening to this or watching this who don't know you. A little bit about your backstory, a lot about your book, The Daughters of Erietown. And as a daughter of Pittsburgh, I know you hear this all the time. I could relate to so much in that book.
I love hearing that.
Legs, pantyhose, come on. Tony Perms, come on.
Well, you and I,
You're
about a couple, I think you're
not much. Let's just keep moving along here. Let's keep moving along.
But what I mean is we're of the same era.
Yeah, but only people from Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Ohio say icebox. So I could relate completely. Yeah. But a lot about your book, and then segue carefully and constructively and wonderfully into what's going on in this world. So let's start with, let's leap to 2005, and you win a Pulitzer Prize. And as Mike said, and he quoted it, it was for pungent columns. And to have the word pungent associated with your name is so great. For pungent columns that provided a voice for the underdog and underprivileged. So by way of introducing yourself to the three people listening to this, watching this, who don't know you, where did you get that voice? What was it about your upbringing? What was it about what your parents taught you? Where did you get that voice or that passion for the underdog, for the underprivileged?
Well, the passion is pretty easy because it's the people I come from. And the same thing that has driven my journalism career for more than 30 years, drove my novel, that we are often depicted as props or problems. We're doofuses. We don't really have full-fledged lives. And I know working class Americans, and keep in mind, we're not talking about just white working class Americans. I know working class Americans to be leading rich interior lives that they hope will translate eventually into better lives for their children. Yeah. So the passion is easy. My mother used to tell us girls all the time, I have two sisters and I had a brother. She used to say, don't marry him until you see how he treats the waitress. And what she meant by that, of course, is how we mistreat the people we're allowed to mistreat is the measure of who we are, how we treat them. And that's driven my work, and it certainly drove my book. So for me, the passion is an obvious thing, just as being a feminist is an obvious thing. I mean, it would be quite hypocritical of me not to be a feminist when I so benefited from the movement. And the only reason I'm on so many op-ed pages even today is because of the women who went before me who said, we got a lot of big ideas and they're not all about recipes. And I say that as somebody who loves to cook.
Talk about what drove you to journalism. Because again, there were plenty of different paths you could have taken, but what drove you to journalism? And if you can work in the story about covering the little boy who was attacked by the Rottweiler, which is a wonderful story.
Joey Jacobs. You know, when you grow up working class, you don't really think you have a million options.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was meeting with my guidance counselor, my parents always said, you're going to go to college. Typical of working class parents, they had no idea how they were going to send me, how they were going to direct me, but they knew I was going to college. And my mom was a nurse's aide and had always wanted to be a nurse. She wanted me to become a nurse, and I just didn't have it in me. I didn't want to, the idea of bloods and needles and all, it just wasn't. So I was talking to my guidance counselor, Mr. Petro, and he said to me, I said, I think I'll be a social worker because they really help people and blah, blah, because I was trying to think, what's the better, less, to me, what was close to that. And he looked at me and he said, I know you well, Connie, and it's going to burn you out pretty quickly. You get so invested in people. And he looked down at my scores and he said, your reading and writing scores are really strong. Have you ever thought about journalism?
Wow.
And I was so stunned to hear that. And I must have looked stunned because he said to me, and I wrote about this in my first book, Connie, you're going to be doing what you do for a long time. You should love what you do for a living. And nobody had told me that. I mean, my father hated his job. He was a utility worker, and it was for 36 years. And my mom was a nurse's aide and then a hospice home care worker. There were parts of her job she loved, but she was not a union worker. And when the nurses moved to unionize, they did not include the nurse's aide. So, she never saw the pay and benefits of that, but she loved her ability to reach patients. And so I became a journalist, and I still can't. Somebody asked me the other day, isn't it time to finally stop writing column? Wouldn't you like to just write fiction all the time? Yeah, part of me was, this book's done well and I'd love to just write fiction, but I still can't believe I get to do this for a living where I can share my opinion. And quite frankly, there still aren't that many women being paid to share their opinions.
Not enough. Yes, and you're the voice. I'm so struck by, and I have followed your work for years and years and years, and so much of your work has been expressing the lives, the fears, the passions, the hopes, the dreams, the dashed hopes of other people. And the novel, to me, seems as though you got to express some of the feelings you wanted to express and say things the way you wanted to say them. But let me ask you a little bit about your work. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how it has changed in the last 5-10 years, social media being the biggest change. So I can't remember which day it was, but I follow you on Twitter, and everybody listening, public service announcement. If you do not follow Connie on Twitter, follow her on Twitter. Follow her elsewhere.
Follow Torie. I just started following you, Torie, and I would say
mine's just about the books. Mine's about other people. But yours, what I love is someday it's the day-to-day, and if you have been a parent, you have been there, getting the child's car seat in and out of your car. The simple, it's not mundane. I have very good friends who just had a baby, and months before the baby arrived, I said, figure out the car seat, because that's the worst thing ever. So you write about that, in which 9 million people can relate to that. And then your tweet from this morning, and I stopped at noon because I thought I can't, but your tweet from this morning, and this was Pete Buttigieg. If you did not see his commentary last night from the debate, you should have watched it. And your tweet from this morning was, I hope this is an accurate quote. You see, when we talk about Midwestern nice, what we mean is we will scorch your hypocrisy into smoldering piles of ash with the voice of your best neighbor. Did these things just come to you? Is this just...
It's that head of mine. I mean, you're right.
Share the inside of your head. How does this happen? You just wake up in the morning and stuff is spitting out.
I just looked at it, I saw it, and I started laughing, and I thought, I just love how people are always so surprised when somebody from the Midwest can be direct. Well, of course we can be direct. That was never the point. I was telling Sherrod later today about that a little bit. And I said, I could really lay someone flat, but I'd always send them home with a potluck because nobody leaves this house hungry. I mean, it's just, we're not people you can just drive right over.
We're not inhuman. We're going to make our point, but we're not inhuman. Yeah.
And the bigger point here, I think, is kindness is strength. Civility is courage, I would say at this point, on the part of a lot of people, where you have people being so mean, so awful, you immediately take over the high ground if you can just respond in a way that lets you stay. I mean, I always say, I do not hate Donald Trump. I will not ever give him that, for example. I don't hate the horrible hate mail that I get those people send to me sometimes. I won't hate them because then they win. Yeah. And I don't know if that's a heartland thing, but it's certainly my thing.
I don't think it's a heartland thing. And we're going to get to your book, The Daughters of Erietown, because it's a wonderful book. Bush 41, when Bush 41 died, God rest his soul, there were a lot of the stories, if you worked for him or if you had covered them, you knew a lot of the stories. And then there were things you hadn't heard. But I was reminded of one of his best lines, and I'm going to get slightly wrong, but it said, hate corrodes the container it's in. Mm-hmm. So you hate somebody, it's not going to hurt them because they're probably jerks and they're probably deserving of your hate, but it's not going to hurt them, but it eats you up inside. And sometimes when I find myself driving on the Beltway going about something or someone, I remember that, and it's calming. So I don't think it's a Midwestern thing. I think that's just a decency thing.
It reminds me of what someone told me when I went through a very difficult divorce in the early 90s. And this is a very common adage now, but I had never heard it back then. Resentment is when you drink the poison and expect someone else to hurt.
That's a great line.
And it's just, I think Carrie Fisher at one point used it. There's just no point to it. You're ceding your ground and you're letting it come in and corrode your soul. And I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about this wonderful book, The Daughters of Erietown. And again, I'm sure you hear this all the time. So many people saying to you, oh my God, I saw myself in that, or that was just like my sister. I'm the youngest of 5 girls growing up in Pittsburgh, but I'm a creature of Washington. And as Connie and her husband know, in Washington, the #1 game is whatever you're talking about, make it about you. So I'm going to try to stop that. But very generally, and I don't want to give too many spoilers because I want people to buy this book from their local independent bookstore. It's the story of 4 generations of women growing up in this northeastern Ohio town. And the classic cliche question to you, the author, is, how much of this is autobiographical? So I got to ask the question, but I'm going to ask it this way. Explain to those who don't know what a Jack and Jesus wall is.
I was just explaining that to a reporter today.
Was the reporter under 12?
No, but it's just, it made him, he was from Texas and I loved him. And I said, well, the Jack and Jesus wall was Jack Kennedy and Jesus side by side in our walls, because my dad was such a union activist and my mom was a Christian. And her philosophy was, I'm going to put my faith in God. And my dad's attitude is, you go right ahead. I'm going to put my faith in the Democrats. And he was a union guy, right? So I always love when people say, wow, how is it being married to a politician? Did you have to get into politics? Are you out of your mind? I grew up in a political home. We were putting those, we were campaigning for local candidates when we were 5, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah. Because
my dad would give us the materials and we were campaigning for people because that's what you did in a union family.
People thought it mattered. Well, it did matter, which we can get to some of that. Okay.
Well, we knew, being working class, we knew that our only strength was in numbers, which also was true of the women's movement.
Yeah.
Our strength was in our numbers, right?
Yep. Okay, so talk about the women in the Daughters of, are they of this town or are they every woman?
Well, I would tell you from reader response, which still comes flowing in every week, and I'm so grateful for that. I hadn't predicted that because I thought that was one of the things you give up when you stop. When you're not writing a column, when you're writing a novel, you don't get to hear from readers in the same way.
Oh, no, they'll find you.
I know, and I'm just delighted about that. I'm hearing from women all around the country. I love when they'll say, Erietown is my town in such and such Kentucky. It is my town where I grew up in Kansas or in Oregon. And I think what they mean ultimately, right, without ever wanting to presume to speak for other women, is there are some universal experiences of being female in America. And if you don't grow up on the coast, you don't grow up with this sense of your own power, at least through the men you marry or the family you're born into. Mm-hmm. It's just a very different thing. But what I also wanted readers to understand, which we've always understood in the working classes, and I was the first in my family to go to college, as you likely know, Torie. Mm-hmm. We have hopes and dreams too. And the difference is when the big problems come and there's no money to fix it.
Right.
That's when lives derail.
Yeah. And I think it's so hard for some people to understand that because they want to think, well, everybody's the same. Rich people, poor people, they have the same kind of problems, the same kind of challenges, the same problems in their families, but money does matter. Money does matter.
It does.
Yeah, without giving away too much, but talk about maybe who's your favorite character in the book. We have one of the running jokes on Chatter on Books is we have a deserted island segment, which can be any one of a million things. But if you had to take one character from the book, The Daughters of Erietown, with you to a deserted island, and that's the only person, Sherrod can't go, dogs can't go, sorry dogs, If you could only take one person from the book with you, who would you take and why? Tell us about that.
I think
person.
I would take Ellie McGinty.
Because
and you know, my editor for the longest time thought this story belonged to Sam McGinty, her daughter. But I always felt, no, this is Ellie's story more than anybody else's.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I would not take Brick because he's a piece of work. But I would take Ellie because I think she shows the greatest hope for evolution. Excuse me, evolving in her own life. But she's also a really good person overall. She was scared all her life.
Right.
She's been afraid of being abandoned. But ultimately, she wants to do good in the world. So I would want to be with Ellie.
And I found her transitional. And I found her trying to, her feet were firmly rooted in a very stereotypical upbringing, background, expectations, but she was aspiring to other things.
She reminds me of so many women I've known who they were part of the feminist movement, even though they weren't included, and they certainly weren't the intended targets of it. But they became part of it in part because they have daughters who come of age during the feminist movement. But there are some things about Ellie that are like my mom. I mean, my mom was a nurse's aide and a hospice home care worker in the last years of her life. I have her badge. I'm looking at it right now. And I don't know if I'm going to tip my camera. My father's hard hat is up there. That yellow thing. Yeah, he was a utility worker for 36 years, and Brick was a utility worker.
Right.
Part of the reason I did that is just simply I knew utility workers and nurses' aides. I knew the work. But I don't know if you recall, there's a list that Ellie makes towards the end of the book, because she's so tired of Brick not listening to her and not understanding why she loves her job. Well, that list is a partial list of a real list my mother wrote that we did not discover until after her death. And that haunts me because I don't know why she did it. She had enough copies for all of us. I worry that she did not she felt that we didn't understand why she loved her work and why it mattered.
Do you think that was therapeutic for her?
Knowing my mom, yeah, maybe. I think she felt in her way she was asserting herself. Ellie gets to be braver than my mom was. Ellie gets to really come at it some. And as you know, we don't want to give anything away, but I even surprised my editor with something we find out Ellie knew all along.
Awesome. Your editor didn't know that?
No. And when because I didn't know it until when she found that wallet. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, you know what, Ellie is nobody's dupe. She's had a lot of naivete about her, but she's had to learn through life. And I wanted her to be a little more complicit in the whole thing.
Excellent. Okay, I'll tell a quick story. So my parents, Pittsburgh, raised 5 girls. God help them. Poor things. My dad was a doctor. And for a big chunk of the upbringing and everything else, my dad worked 24/7. I mean, it's hilarious when you hear about concierge doctors now, because that's what he was. And my mom did everything to raise all of us, everything. And I don't know how she did it. It was like a loaves and fishes thing, but she got it done. And then in probably the 80s, I guess, and we're all, the 5 girls are gone, flown the coop, and my dad is still working hard, and my mom has gone to work with him in his office. It's great, it's wonderful. And my mom gets sick, and she was very sick. And so my dad now has to do many of the things that now, not the 5 girls, but he has to do many of the things that my mom had been doing. He has to get the groceries. He has to get the dry cleaning. He has to get the car inspected. He has to get the dog to the vet. He has to do all these things that my mother did, in addition to raising 5 girls. And I remember my dad was was a quite enlightened guy in many ways, but I remember talking to him one night and he was all upset. And I go, what are you upset about? And he goes, I lost the dry cleaning ticket. And I said, Dad, you live in a town of 3,000 people. You have been going to the same dry cleaner for 40 years. I think you're going to be okay. He goes, I never had any idea how much your mother did. I never had any idea. But he had this epiphany in his early 80s. And it was really, really something. So when I read that story about the list, I went, my mother probably wrote lists like that. On any given day, she did 9 million things. Okay, another story from the book I want you to tell carefully. Sam and her father and race. And you and your father and race.
Sounds like you saw the Atlantic piece.
Sounds like I read the book. And I know about you. And I know about Motown records.
Oh, I loved Motown. I grew up with Motown.
Best.
You know, I wrote about my dad's struggle with racism for the Atlantic during, I think it was during Obama's when he was running for his second term. And I was frustrated with hearing all these. I hate when people say, well, if you come from the working class, you're going to be racist because you grew up with racists.
Right.
Well, first of all, not everybody does grow up with racists. Certainly I did. But our roots are our beginnings. They're not our excuses. And that doesn't automatically mean
Can
you're
you
going to
say
be
that
like
again? Say it again.
Our roots are our beginnings. They are not our excuses.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And that, you know, we reach a certain point in our lives, we got to decide who we're going to be, regardless of where we came from. So certainly that struggle was when Sam goes to an elementary school where every year half her classmates are Black. That was my school. And I have the class pictures on that Atlantic piece to show it. But I learned something, you know, both my parents are gone. They both died in their 60s. In fact, my mom died at the age that my novel came out in June.
Wow.
And she'd already been gone 20 years. So as I was writing about that relationship with Sam and her dad, because I love Motown, but my parents were like Sam's parents. My parents were 19 and 20 when I was born. So they were into the younger music in some ways, you know, with Neil Diamond and Rudy, I mean, all that. But then Motown came and I could get CKLW because I was growing up in Ashtabula, which of course is a version of Erietown.
Yes.
What I've come to understand now, yes, my father made a big deal about how he hated how much his girl hated Black music. But what he also hated is he lost me. I mean, he didn't have to. He could have shown an interest in my music, but he didn't have it in him. And because of that, we really parted ways over the one thing he thought we still had in common.
Did he hate it because he lost you to music, or did he hate it because he lost you to that music?
I think he hated it because he lost the ritual of our sitting down together after buying records together at the store and sitting down and listening to them together. He didn't want to hear Motown. And I still love Motown. I play it when I cook a lot. I love Motown.
All the time. And we could spend half an hour about my personal conflict over Michael Jackson, but that's for another show. That's for another show. I used to have
a poster of him in my wall when I was 13.
Oh God. I said to somebody the other day, I can't forgive the Catholic Church, but I find myself forgiving Michael Jackson. God help us. Did you find writing this book cathartic?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that it was rewarding in that. One of the things I tell my students all the time is, look, you can't say that people think things or they believe things. The best you can do is you can say, they say they believe things. They say they think these things. Right. Well, when you're writing a novel, I know exactly what's in their heads. And I know why they're doing what they do, and it's been quite freeing. But I also think about what May Sarton, the late novel and poet who wrote a number of published journals. And I read her Journal of Solitude. I got an old, you know how sometimes you can get one of those old library covered copies, so it's in really good shape. And she wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that perhaps only in fiction can we be completely honest.
That's a great line.
That's true, then this is the truest story I've ever told.
Awesome. Awesome. Do you wish you could have had those conversations with your parents?
I don't know. I mean, there are a couple of major things in the book that do have some reticence.
Sure.
In my life, but I don't know that it would have been helpful to bring it up with them. They weren't those people.
Yeah.
I think my mom, maybe. My father never would have been going to have that
my
conversation.
Mom, not that I would ever have been, you know, I stopped growing emotionally at 16. Not that I ever would have had those kind of conversations with either of my parents. My mom over 6 glasses of white wine. Sure. Right. We could have done that. Okay.
I mean, my mom adored me. You know, I always took care of my mother. And that way I was very much like Sam. I always had to take care of my mother.
Yeah.
But in her latter years, there was nothing I could do wrong in her eyes. And I think I could have gotten away with asking her just about anything.
That's a good mom. That's a really good mom.
It's a different mom from when I grew up with. You know, people change. And
yes, they do.
One of the ways she changed.
And that's, okay, wait, now I got to find the line, but maybe you can find it for me. Even when you don't know it, life is rearranging you. That's, I think, my favorite line. But can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's just that we don't have as much control over our lives as we want to think. And often a lot of the tension comes from wanting to have that kind of control instead of responding to the circumstances we've got.
Yeah. And people do change.
People do change.
Even in their later years, they do change.
Well, my philosophy is always, I mean, I've tried to make it be, I can't say always in the last 20 years or so, is you can't ask people to change and then not give them a chance to.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Okay. We're talking to Connie Schultz. We are talking about about a lot of things, but her fabulous book, The Daughters of Erietown. And I really tell people, go buy this book. Go to your local independent bookstore. They have all improved how they do online buying. Get it now because it's fabulous. From the sublime to the ridiculous. Can we talk about the fly at last night's debate? And if Connie Schultz if Connie Schultz wanted to write a column about where we are in politics right now and use the fly as the peg, how would the Pulitzer Prize winner do that? No pressure.
Well, I did just file a column. I didn't say anything about Pence, but I would say this, that—
Is the fly in it? And did you name them?
No, it isn't. I did not, only because so many people are playing with the fly right now.
Well, the fly's got about 20 Twitter accounts.
I know. I would just say, if the most important thing people remember of your performance that night is that you had a fly embedded in your snow white hair, pretty much tells you where you are.
Some might consider that a success. I'm just saying.
You know, the ones who think it's a success are the ones who are going to be very disappointed after election day.
So can you give us a hint of your column?
I just wrote about, I mean, they're arguing over the debates. With in person, Trump balked at the virtual one they were going to do, but of course he did, because what is Donald Trump's biggest fear? The mute button.
Right.
He doesn't want to be shut up. So now they're negotiating, and I mean, he's the COVID patient, and we're trying to negotiate with him, and now he wants to have one towards the end. And I said, you know, you could see his problem. If they turn off his mic when he's supposed to be done to teach, what's he supposed to do? He's going to sit there. He doesn't want to listen to Biden. He can't mock him. He can't taunt him. So he'll probably try another tweet storm, which always, to me, when I read those tweet storms, it sounds like some kid in a bathroom trying to get in one more last thing while his mom's banging on the door and saying, what are you doing in there? Get out of there. That's how it feels when I read his tweet.
It's one of the many reasons. I pretty much stick to beer these days, as Mike knows. But you know, after 2 or 3 beers, I'll just hand my phone to somebody in my family, go, just keep it away from me. Just keep this away from me. Okay, you can't talk about the current inhabitant of the White House. You can't talk about politics without talking about social media. Sure. So for me, it's a chicken or egg thing. Did social media create an environment in which someone like a Donald Trump, no experience, no right, et cetera, could thrive and succeed? I'm doing air quotes around succeed. Or did Donald Trump create a world in which that's what is really important, being able to succeed in that environment? And I agree with you completely. 2 things. Whenever they start talking about process, you realize it's not worth listening anymore. But secondly, that's his fuel. That's his oxygen. So is social media what's created the Donald Trumps of the world, or did Donald Trump create the world in which that's important? That's space.
I think the answer is yes and yes.
Yeah.
You know, his show came right on the brink of social media, right? He did I had never seen an episode of The Apprentice. I never have. I don't have any interest in watching it. I was not one of those people who was going to want to watch that. Certainly with social media. I mean, he has conducted the presidency through Twitter.
Yeah. And
this has been really bad on so many different levels and for so many different reasons. Well, that's it. I mean, I don't know how we can, what we hope is when Joe Biden is elected president, and I do think he's going to be elected in a landslide, that the first thing his staff will say to him, no need to be on Twitter. We'll handle Twitter. When we need you to be there, you can have your initials. Right. But we're done with that. We don't lead by tweets because we have a lot of reassuring to do to the world at large, not just our own country. And his number one task, I mean, if they're going to be using Twitter, it's going to be how to inform the public to stay safe as we get closer to a vaccine that people can actually take.
Trusted sources. I'm looking over your shoulder at your First Amendment pillow and dating myself for years and years and years. And this is Republican candidates and politicians and public officials. It is Democratic politicians and candidates and officials. For years and years and years, they used to always say, particularly when they got to the national level, we just need to get past the incredibly antagonistic filter of the national media. So every quasi-serious contender at the national level would always set up interviews with, somebody from the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Arizona Daily Star, right? And thinking, if we can speak to them, then we can avoid the negative filter of the national media. A, it never worked. B, I mean, as somebody who used to have to set up those ridiculous things, it never worked. B, the journalist from the Cleveland Plain Dealer would smoke your candidate, so it worked out. But for decades, politicians have been trying to get past the filter, and I see it as the First Amendment right, of the media. And I never thought it was a good thing then. I still don't think it's a good thing now. And one of the horrors for me about social media, and I was concerned about this way before Donald Trump popped on the scene, is just by sheer volume, it can start to have a qualitative effect. And just by sheer volume, it can start to have real and meaningful impacts without any scrutiny, without any due diligence. Is this true or it's not? It scares me to death. And one of the reasons I hope 3 weeks from now goes the way we think it will go, is I want some rationality. I want some common sense. I want some governors and some people thinking, what we're saying, has it gone through the scientist? Has it really been vetted? These kinds of things.
Well, that's right. I don't think we're going to, I liked Kamala Harris's answer last night. Would she take a vaccine that was recommended by Dr. Fauci and other public health doctors? Absolutely. Would she take it if it was being promoted by Trump? No, she would not.
Yeah.
I understand that no matter where you are in the political spectrum, I can't imagine at this point you trust Donald Trump with the safety of the lives of the people you love. Forget just your own life, anybody that you love. Yeah. I certainly don't at this point.
I still spend a lot of times, for reasons not worth explaining, in lots of different places, Midwest, down the South, Pennsylvania, et cetera, in completely apolitical circles. And one of the things that concerns me deeply is the lack of faith, because of what's been going on for the last 7-8 months, the lack of faith in the public health system. That is dangerous. You want to be able to count on the scientists. You want to be able to count on the leading health officials to say, this is what we ought to be doing, those kinds of things. So that worries me a lot. But let's put your writing hat back on. Let's say it's 2050, and you're going to write a column about, remember when we had that pandemic? How would you address it? How would you talk about it? How would you write about it? Or can you even project yourself out that far?
I would be very, very old. So I would,
but very smart, very wise. Be very wise.
Immediately celebrate myself as a walking miracle.
Exactly.
Upright. How would I cast this? Well, I tell my students all the time, both classes, my ethics class and my opinion writing class, they're keeping weekly pandemic journals. And which I actually recommend everybody who's listening, because we will, of course, have access to the historical facts of the time. We will forget who we were in this time if we don't keep track of it. I learned that from writing the memoir of Sherrod's Senate race in 2006. That came out in 2007. I was surprised that had I not had all the really big stack of notebooks, I would not have remembered all that I thought I would. We are different in many ways now, and we don't even know all the ways we're different yet. Certainly, most of us are contemplating things we used to take for granted, that we hope we won't take for granted in the future, right? I think that some very good things are going to come out of this. It's hard to imagine that right now because it's so scary. And we are a nation of grief. We are a nation of mourners. 210,000 have died. That means hundreds of thousands more are grieving. And not only that, but there are a lot of people whose loved ones were dying of other things, but they could not be with them at the end because of COVID. So in that way, there is so much to recover from. But I think we've really been able to take stock of ourselves individually during this time. And that makes me optimistic about what comes next. And so I could imagine writing about this decades later and saying, remember when we were so silly that we thought this, or we used to squander this.
Yes.
And now we understand.
We used to think this was important.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been in a hair salon since March. I have a friend who cuts hair and she's cut it twice out on the deck. I'm using box dye and I can't believe how little I care.
Yes, it's okay. A couple of weeks ago, we had on Chatter on Books, we had Ken Follett, who's just incredible. And after you buy Connie's book, Daughters of Erietown, go get Evening and Morning. Wonderful book. And I had read several interviews in which he said, I don't want to write about the pandemic. I know too much about plagues. I won't do it. But we got him to say, if he were alive 100 years from now, how would he write the book about the pandemic of 2020? And for him, it was a lot about hubris. He goes, oh, and you could go through every book that Ken Follett has ever written, and there are always people in power who think they know everything, who think their power in and of itself is what is important. And because of that kind of attitude, a lot of bad things happen. And I'm not doing justice to how he described it, but if Ken Follett ever writes
it sounds very much like Ken. What I would do is I would do the deep dive into a particular family probably.
Yes.
And show what's going on around them as well, but show how this changed a family. In fact, I would probably have what you've got going, those 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
20-somethings who didn't think they were going to be with you. I just think there's so much about life that Lillian Hillman called it the daily mess of life.
Yeah.
And how did it change and how did we adapt? And who are we once we're finally free? I mean, imagine this moment comes when we start en masse getting vaccines. How quickly do we return to what we thought we used to be?
Yeah.
And how much of it will be, I mean, I've thought about this a little bit because part of it's because I miss my grandchildren. We have 7 grandchildren.
Yeah.
I haven't seen several of them for many, many months. And I just wonder, are there things though that we'll miss about the pandemic, like Sherrod being home a lot, for example? I think about that.
Mm-hmm.
All of our long walks that we've had that never would have occurred. I'm needle pointing again. I'm cooking like crazy again.
Yeah.
Part of it's because I read Winston Churchill's, I got it right here. I love this little book, Painting as a Pastime.
Oh, it's great.
Churchill.
That is great.
And his basic argument, as you know, is if you really love your work, you're the one who needs to find something else to love too.
Yes.
And so it really got me to thinking about, what do I need to do to balance that out in my life right now?
Yeah. Somebody described it to me as people like us need to find things like that to lead almost normal lives.
Huh. Yeah.
I feel as though the
Perfect
pandemic,
way.
we live almost normal lives. Okay.
Yeah.
I have just been going on and on and on with Connie, which I could do forever. But Mike, you've got to jump in here. Do we have questions that we should be answering? Because I've got 9 million more questions, but.
We have a couple, and you could put some in there too. So just want to encourage everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat function. It's just a little bit easier for us to keep track of it. And also, before we go on, please make sure if you are a student or you're a Granville local, you go to the Reader's Garden to get your books. If you mention you get 10% off for tonight. Okay. And Margot's telling us Connie's and Torie's books. One more plug for our local bookstore. 10% off if you mention the Beck series. Place orders via Instagram or by email. Available for purchase for store pickup or campus delivery. Venmo accepted.
Awesome.
So you have no excuse, basically. There's a million ways to book.
No, and they've gotten good at it. We are big supporters at Chatter, as Mike knows, about local independent bookstores. And where they are now versus where they were in March is just night and day. And they've gotten much better at online, at deliveries, those kinds of things, which they'll say, quite honestly, we probably should have been better at that before, but the pandemic forced us to get better. So
there you go again, another nice thing that comes out of it, right?
Right.
Learn things.
Right.
I like this first question for both of you, which is, the month ahead feels daunting and endless. That's mild. What joyful novels might you suggest to help carry us through?
Connie, you go first.
No, I confess I'm probably not reading. I mean, I love the novels I'm reading. I find joy in so many of them. I do think
too.
I'm about to return to Wallace Stegner's Crossing to Safety.
Wow.
Because I haven't read it in a number of years, and I do so very much love that book. So that's my immediate thought. There are so many. What I don't do, Mike, and I'm sure you can understand this, I'm not naming any books of friends, because then I alienate other friends. I don't want to upset anybody.
I'm going to go dark. People don't need to see me, but you can still hear me. Torie, what about you? What would be a book that you find joy in?
Wow, I find so many books so interesting. And I recently, those who can see this behind me, I recently reorganized my bookshelf behind me, and I have 65 plus books from the show over the last couple of years. And my daughter this morning was coming through with 2 of the dogs. She's like, what's your favorite or what? I loved every single one of them. And maybe just because it's recently, but John Sayles' The Yellow Earth, I don't know if this qualifies as joyful, but John Sayles to me is joyful. If you've not seen the movie Brother from Another Planet, which comes from the 80s, which was prescient in terms of race relations, watch that movie. Just a really fascinating guy. And this is a wonderful book about a small town that undergoes the boom and bust of fracking, right? Tons of money, tons of people, all sorts of things happen. And then what happens on the far side. And I didn't want this book to end. I did not want this book to end. I'm not just saying this because she's on the show. I didn't want Connie's book to end. Oh, I was in love with, and I wanted to love to hate some of the characters, but I didn't want it to end. And I just and then I had in my head, this is who should play the person in the movie and these kinds of things. So if I had to only pick two, and Mike, we're going to have you on the show in a few weeks to talk about your next Midland, but I would do Connie's book first and then John Sayles' book, The Yellow Earth. It's fabulous.
Great. Here's one from Wendy for Connie. It says, I feel like I've lost my father over racism just recently. I feel like I need to stand my ground, but I'm also torn because the thought of not having a relationship with him as he gets older is scary. Any thoughts or advice?
Sure. Well, I don't know that I have advice for you. I certainly know how you feel. As I often say, it's easier to hate the racist you don't know. It's quite another when the racist is the person who also, in my case, put you through college and helped raise you. I don't know if Wendy has any children. For me, one of the break-off points was I would not let him have those conversations in front of my kids. Mm. And so we had some moments. But, you know, the piece I wrote for The Atlantic, he came around towards the end because my mother was dying. And so many people, including the chief resident, were Black, who were taking care of her. And it helped her. And so my argument for you, Wendy, there in part is this, that I never think they're beyond reach of us if they really love us. That doesn't mean it isn't extremely hard. But it sounds like what you're afraid of is you're going to have a lot of regret if you're not in touch with them. I often encourage people to write out what you're feeling and send it to the person that with whom you're having this dispute. Really lay out for him why this is hurting you, not why just you're angry, but why this is hurting you. I did that with my dad and it actually helped.
Great. From Jean, if Connie could have a position in the federal government, what would it be? I know she loves her writing, but where does she think she could make the most difference?
Well, I suppose I'd like to be the White House press secretary. That's never.
No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. I'm sorry. Commercial break. I have to interrupt.
I know. But
years ago, that job gave up any element of importance. Years ago.
I think I want to be C.J. Craig, which
yes, exactly. Okay, you can be the movie version. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I respect journalists. I love journalists and I respect them.
Yes, but that job hasn't respected. But that job, and it is Democrats as well as Republicans, has not respected journalists for decades.
Yeah, I would insist on it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
This is from a student. She says, how would you make a publication more resonant with an audience that doesn't want to believe or even acknowledge the information you're trying to give?
You can't reach people who don't want to be reached. And I would say if your whole goal of publication is trying to convince people who don't want to hear you, that's pretty challenging. On the other hand, I always tell this story. When I was writing about gay rights early on in 2004, and I was writing about it a lot, and an elderly reader left a phone message for me once, and he said, I just want to tell you that I am 87, or 84, I think it was. I grew up in a conservative home. I was raised in a conservative church. I live in a conservative community. I want to get where you are. Wow. So please be a little patient with me. And that was really instructive for me on how to move forward writing it. Demonizing people who disagree with me reaches no one. And so I guess that would be the point of your publication is you don't want to give up your values. You don't want to sacrifice your principles, but there's a way to close a distance with people. And it always starts with being open to listening to them. And the way you accomplish that is to telegraph that you're willing to.
That's great.
Great advice. I'm taking notes. I'm sitting here taking notes, by the way.
Someone's asking for the rest of the saying. I don't want to get it wrong. Our roots are our beginnings, but not our excuses. Is that right?
Right. Our roots are our beginnings, but they are not our excuses.
Next question is, I think this means your novel. I read your novel and loved it. I think it captured the huge changes women have struggled with. I think our country has many women in the middle of these same struggles. Do you agree? I think perhaps many women want to return to the nostalgia of traditional female roles.
Well, what I hope that I showed in Erietown is there was no nostalgia involved, right? It was always hard. I mean, the Leave It to Beaver shows, the Donna Reeds of the world, those weren't the families I knew growing up. Life was hard because there wasn't a lot of money. There wasn't a lot of respect for women. I think part of what I'm trying to show is let's not romanticize the past, because the past was difficult. There are things we can, I mean, was it nice to know everybody in town? Sure, unless you did something wrong. And wrong could be defined as get pregnant out of marriage, fall in love with a Black boy. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that your life exploded then in a small town. Instead of romanticizing the past, I would like us to look for the gifts of the future, and especially the love that's in our present. There are so many good people around us. We live in the city of Cleveland, and we're a minority race in the zip code where we live, and I am just overwhelmed on a regular basis by just how good people are and how they keep giving us second chances.
Connie, what caused you to move back to the city?
I just had to be back in the integrated neighborhoods of my youth. Mm-hmm. I just couldn't stand living with all white people. Mm-hmm. I felt the difference. And white people who had fled Cleveland for the most part.
Right, right.
Marianne wants to know how Connie and Sherrod stay calm. I assume she asked Connie because we already know that Torie drinks to stay calm.
I wouldn't say I don't stay calm, but I stay hopeful. And I stay hopeful because I know that I've had so much contact with regular people in the country, which is most of America. And I'm very optimistic about this election as long as everybody votes. And everybody must vote.
Right. Hey, Mike, can I jump? Can I pile on a question? It's kind of related to that one. And again, this comes from growing up in Pittsburgh. And when I was a kid, my dad was a doctor, small town, and 75, 80% of his patients were steel workers, coal miners, people associated with that industry. And in the town, and my friends, yeah, my dad was a doctor. That was a nice job to have, whatever. We knew coal miners. That was a very honorable, good job. We knew steel workers. That was a good, honorable job. Everybody took value from what they contributed to the community. And something happened and something changed. And I like to blame the politicians because that's just so easy. But something changed in which those jobs, the steel worker, the coal miner, the person who cleaned the plant so the factory could run efficiently, their work wasn't considered as honorable. And people were told, you have to go to college, you have to do this. What happened? What changed? And one of the early authors we had on the show, Scott Price, who wrote Playing Through the Whistle, which was about Aliquippa, PA. And it was ostensibly about sports, but it was really about the change in environment in Pittsburgh and what happened when the steel industry was collapsing. But what happened where those jobs and that work wasn't honorable anymore, and it wasn't something to be admired? Because when I was a kid, it was.
Part of it is more of America went to college and got full of itself, right? Part of it. Part of it was we started deciding that they were expendable because we could get cheaper labor in other countries that we could exploit and where we could exploit their workers and in many cases their children to build the same things that they used to build.
And do it at 1/10 the cost. Yeah,
exactly. So it really was the notion of it all is the bottom line, obviously, the deciding factor. And you were so right to bring it up, because what also changed with that then is that these men who were accustomed to building things and making things, and I mean, think of the scene where Brick McGinty shows his kids how electricity is made, right? Because his daughter thinks he's just sending a lightning rod to the light switch, which is how I used to think of it, right? And I had to learn how to do all that. I got a union manual from 1968, which included all the just show people, want them to know, here's how electricity is made at your plant. And so I looked at it and I thought, all right, well, if I were drawing that for a child, what would that look like? I wanted Brick to be able to do that. Well, these were mostly men who, and this cannot be overstated, they also thought they could work in good jobs so their wives wouldn't have to. Right. And I remember my father, when my mother had to go to work when I was still it's very much Brooke's situation where he goes to college, she wants to go to college, so the mother goes to work, because even on his union wages and his union benefits, it's not going to be enough.
Yeah.
And that's what happened all across the country. And these men felt powerless. You know, the suicide rate has steadily increased among working class men who don't feel there's anything left they can do. We don't talk about all that. We just want to make them all racist. That's what we do. You know, it's an unfortunate, and it's an untrue narrative about many of them.
Yeah, I was going to say it's untrue, and it's unhelpful, and it's dangerous, because that means you're not addressing the real causes.
Well, that's right. Well, it's easier to just dismiss them as discardable, because then you can keep sending your companies overseas.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, I'm sorry, on that happy note, back to you.
That was great, because it actually dovetails nicely into this question from Gwen, who says that she grew up and went to school and college in Ohio, and now I live in New Jersey. What do you think the biggest misconception about Ohio and the Midwest is for people in metropolitan areas on the coasts?
Oh, well, I live in the city of Cleveland. I live in very liberal Northeast Ohio, so we'll start there. I mean, Ohio, I remember in 2004, the Plain Dealer did a series called The Four Ohioes, Five Ohioes, because the state is so different. Appalachia, for example, versus Northwestern versus Northeastern Ohio. So the state has always been very different. But as I always tell my students, you can find anybody say something stupid on any street corner in America. And unfortunately, very often they come to Ohio to find them. And we've always got our stupid people. So, but also just on the light side, I cannot tell you how many of my New York and Washington friends I have to remind when they say, all right, well, what time is it where you are? Same time as where you are.
Yes.
They just really, there is this notion that we are the other in so many ways.
Okay, this time of year, Connie, every presidential year, how do you like it when you hear Rust Belt? How do you feel about Rust Belt?
I hate that term because it makes it sound all used up and beyond the point, right? Yeah. And I don't see us that way at all, but I understand why it's useful, because if you don't live here, it sounds like a handy way to describe a bunch of people you'd ever met.
Yeah. In the 80s, I found myself, one of my many failed careers, I worked on a campaign in Kansas, in Topeka, Kansas, Moquet for Kansas. And we're traipsing around, visiting, doing this and that, whatever. We went to the University of Kansas to do an event, go Jayhawks. Lawrence, Kansas, beautiful, unbelievable school, spectacular. And I remember going to a payphone, because that's what you used then, and called the head of my school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and said, why did you never tell me about places like this? Because Pittsburgh, gateway to the West, but still, you know, to the Midwest, you're still kind of East Coast. And the coasts don't think about places like Topeka, Kansas. But you go there and you go, wow, there was great stuff going on here. Or in Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah.
Last one from a student. It's a writing question. So this is a good one. What advice do you have for writing about a character whose background is very different from yours? For example, different race, different class, different time period, region.
Yeah, it's touchy. I mean, I would say it, and I'm not proud of this, but in this time we're in, I would not presume to write a main character who is Black, for example. I think if you're going to do that, I mean, I can just say, even writing about a utility worker, I had to interview utility workers. I'm not a man. I haven't worked in a plant. I spent an awful lot of time talking to people who do it. So I think that's always the way to do it. This is when the journalist in me kicks in. What you don't know, you research. What you don't know, you interview. I am a big believer in interviewing people, and then also have some good second readers for your book, or for your story, if you're talking about it, or your essay, and have it be people who don't look like you. Better yet, have it be people that are similar to the person you're trying to depict.
Yeah. Because
you want to get it right. I don't think it means you can't write about people who aren't like you. I just think you got to do the hard work of making sure you're not getting them wrong.
Great. One more student question. It says, Connie, I know Torie asked a version of this question, but from more of a mental perspective, how do you even write about something as monumental as a pandemic? I've tried it with poetry, but there's some sort of block there. Is it even possible to write while experiencing whatever it is that's so monumental, or do you have to wait until once you've had time to reflect on it?
I think that's a wonderful question. What you can write about in the moment is what you're feeling in the moment. You really can't know the full narrative arc of all this because we're still in the thick of it. That's why I encourage pandemic journals, because it will help you come back to yourself when you do want to start writing about it in different ways. right now I have no interest. I'm working on my second novel, and I've made every effort to make sure we're not even getting close to any of that, because I just think, to me, it feels, I don't think it feels experimental at all. It just feels presumptive. That's for me, that there's just too much we don't know yet. But I am keeping those notes to remember who I was and who I loved, how they were in this moment, because that is all material. I mean, all of life is, always. And I tell my students that my students tend to be, a third of them are working class families, so they're first in their family to go to college. And they're working 2 and 3 jobs to stay in school. And I always tell them, you're going to have such a leg up from somebody whose first real job is the one when they're sitting in the desk next to you, because you've been working so hard for so long that you know people, and that you know all kinds of people, and it all informs your ability to empathize. Because I think the best questions come from the ability to empathize with people and to understand, I may not know you, I may not know what your life is like, but I sure want to know as much as I possibly can. And that's what you can get from working in restaurants and dry cleaners and waiting on people. And I have a student who's working at a drive-through right now. It's very busy, a drive-in, very busy all of a sudden. Everyone wants to watch movies out of the drive-in screen. And I tell them, all these conversations you're having with people, take notes. Take notes. It's all material.
Well, that's it. This was great. This was as lovely as I thought it would be. I've put the link to Torie's podcast, Chatter on Books, in the chat. Please, please, please go to it. Download it on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts. It's fantastic. It's always a great conversation. You'll really enjoy listening to her and David Aldridge. And who else is on there with you now? You have a rotate. Is Jeannie still coming on?
Jeannie comes in occasionally. We have rotating guests all the time. We have you back on November 2nd. We have Mike Crowley back with us on November 2nd. We're going to try very hard to be current without really addressing the magnanimity of what's going on the next day.
Yeah.
So everyone should listen to that one for sure. Very hard.
Yeah. So, but it's a great
Torie,
podcast.
you are a wonderful interviewer, by the way. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's easy when the talent is as good as you. Easy.
Well, thanks so much, everyone out there, for joining us. We have recorded this. I do not know what we do where we send it. Margot knows that. What do we do to this, Margot?
This is my new favorite emoji. I have no idea. It goes into some archive, but in any event, we'll have it for posterity. I just want to join the chorus scrolling up in the chat of thanking you both for being here. Thanks to this wonderful endowed series that Denison has, the Beck series. Thanks to everybody who zoomed in. I love this one aspect of Zoom that we get to reach so many more people, alumni, friends, people from all over the place. And students, thanks for taking time out from homework and all the other stuff you've got going on.
Yes,
for joining this wonderful, wonderful conversation.
I'm sorry not to meet all of you. That was the plan originally.
I can't wait till this is over and we can have you at Denison and in person. So I'm looking forward to that.
I would love that.
What's the expression, next year in Jerusalem? Next year in person.
Next year in person.
Exactly. Thanks, Torie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
love you all.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Bye, Connie. Bye, Torie.
Wear your mask.
Bye.
Good night. Yeah, wear your mask.
Wear your mask and vote.
Register, vote.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.